Chapter 20. Dealing with Ghosts. Rumours of Verig's battles to bend the fractious orc tribes to his will were common now. News of his victories came through Trubios' trade with the Fraka tribe, and should have caused concern, but Verig was cunning. The Hurkan demanded that the human caravans be left alone. Orc raids had never been rarer. Some even started to praise the peace of the Verig. Fools. Rain will always fall. The wind will always howl. And orcs will always attack. Jorun Weaver, The Keetish Cycle. As she recovered under Leusios' care, Elayna came to a strange decision. She resolved to be lost, and would remain so until she decided to find herself again. She drifted through her daily tasks around the farm. Visitors were politely tolerated but never entertained. Weeks became months, and months matured into a year. Another winter passed, and Calisgwyn rose again to cast her bitter spell, discouraging the earth's desire for spring. Today she had been splitting wood. In the past she had shared that task with 5 men. The logs that Toothly, Niall, and Hal had split were long gone. Kerne's had lasted into the tepid summer of yesteryear. Now she was on to Leusios's. 2 years lost to grief, counted in the wood chopped by dead men. Valiados didn't chop any wood for me. She pondered out loud and shook her head with a bitter laugh, and she stoked up her fire and hung her father's cooking pot over it. There was a sharp rap at her door. Definitely not Leusios's jaunty rat-tat-tat. Elayna pulled her cloak tighter in preparation for the damp gust of air and opened the door. Mistress Murgathwin stood at the top of her steps, primely erect as always. "Good afternoon, Elayna." "Come in." She gestured the older woman in. "It's good to see you." "And I've not seen enough of you," Murgathwin scolded her gently. "I need to check on your planting." Elayna understood. "Bad prospects for the wheat crop?" Murgathwin nodded, and winced as she bent her knees to sit on a stool by the fire. "Aye, me dear, if Alfeina doesn't show her mercy soon, then we'll need your beans to get through next winter. 2 bitter winds in 2 years." She gave a deep sigh. "A cruel turn. And every nugget that gets from the mines to the trade road is a struggle. There's not enough money to buy all the food we need. Leusios helped me, so the planting's done." "Good." The older woman nodded grimly. "What's happening with the mines?" Elayna asked. "Has Leusios not shared his woes?" "No. Whenever he visits, he only talks of his plans and a bright future." Mistress Murgathwin pursed her wrinkled lips and drew in a long breath through her dainty nose. "The mines struggle, and the flow of gold is choked by constant and uncanny misfortunes." The silence drew out until Murgathwin moved her gaze from the fire to her. "So what about you, me dear?" Elayna shivered and drew closer to the fire. "I don't know. Survival's not the problem. Not anymore." "I guessed as much from Trubios' regular visits." She looked at the spinster sharply. "Who told you?" Murgathwin sniffed, raising both eyebrows. "Oh, me dear, credited old woman with some brains. Kerne left you his share in the gold mines, didn't he?" "Aye, but I didn't want anyone to know." "I won't tell a soul. And you can trust Trubios. He's a decent sort." The older woman hugged herself and frowned. "Aye, we're all on our knees. All the minor houses from Duria have given up and gone home. An ill will is set against us. Landslides, shaft collapses, accidental fires. It's a miracle so few have died. And then there's Jorwin's curse." Her mentor stared dolefully into the fire. "Nature has turned on Blackstone, Elayna. Your father would ridicule me for saying it, but all our ills seem to stem from the night we lost Kerne." Storms blow out of the east without warning. Unexpected frosts fall sharp on new crops. It's nature's way when a bard is stirred to wrath." They both gazed into the fire for a while. Then Murgathwin gave a humorless laugh. "Did you hear that some of the miners have even erected a shrine to Kerne?" the matriarch asked, watching Elayna's reaction out of the corner of her eye. The half-orc's name put her on edge. "Why would they do that?" Murgathwin smiled ruefully. "You've not heard of the miracle of the wholesome food?" "No." "The miners talk about it often," Murgathwin explained. "Kerne took spoiled food and made it whole again." Elayna raised her hand. "Before you ask again, no, I still don't remember anything of that night." Murgathwin pursed her lips, her question forestalled. Elayna felt the slight lump of bone where her skull had healed, imperceptible to the eye, but a definite ridge to the touch. "I'm sorry. They say he was about to force himself on me, that they saved me. Do you believe them?" "No, and I never shall." Murgathwin raised her bony fingers to follow the beautiful carvings that coiled and flowed around the central pillars of the hut. "He loved you, Elayna, but you cannot define yourself by the love of men alone." "I don't. I think that's why I'm making Leusios wait. I've lost too many good men. I need to find myself first." Mistress Murgathwin raised an eyebrow and looked at her sharply. "That's wise beyond your years. He is gone. I came out here because it's time you finished your grieving." She rapped her knuckles on the wood. "Blackstone needs you, Elayna farmer." Elayna nodded slowly. "If Blackstone gives me the truth, then I'll get on with me life." "Then speak to Micrig or Leusios. They were both there when it happened." "Micrig's back from his exile?" "Nay, he's still living on Elayna's grace in the woods, and will be for a while yet. He's been true to his penance and delivered meat from his hunts." Murgathwin shook her head. "I tried to explain to Jorwin, but he was too deep in his grief. Blackstone needs everyone to contribute. That's why the hunters have always been important. Unfortunately, they knew that too, and it made them arrogant. I can't say Micrig is a changed man, but perhaps he's a little wiser. Talk to Leusios. Cast aside his charms and fancies. Demand the truth." Hothrog strode towards the commotion at the camp perimeter. His scouts had watched these intruders press deep into the Fraka Hills, and his curiosity had been provoked. Now they had arrived, and a fight had already started. The orcs parted to give their warlord a better view. He folded his arms and studied the scene before him. Gorstak, the she-orc who had chosen to breed with Hothrog, came to his side. "It's not Trubios," she said. Hothrog grunted as he watched the young orc warrior called Skrakcha in full battle fury against the she-man. He took all the details in and grimaced. Skrakcha was expendable, but sooner or later, Varag would turn his horde south. Then he would need every warrior. However, watching the human she-warrior fight was mesmerizing. He did not want to interrupt it. She was strong yet subtle. Her sword flowed with the power of her body, and her small shield, edged in steel, was nearly as dangerous. Skrakcha launched an enthusiastic flurry of blows with his axe. They were accurate, but dealt against a greater foe who dodged and deflected each in turn. Hothrog nodded. Yes, the younger warrior would be useful one day, and there was no point in having him humiliated today. He unfolded his arms and strode towards the fight. The cheering orcs shouted even louder in anticipation. "Skrakcha!" he yelled. The warrior turned to his chief and took Hothrog's fist to his face. He went flailing backwards and sprawled onto his back with a look of dazed shock. Hothrog turned and bellowed at the she-man. "Yield!" Her control was perfect. She recovered her posture, pulling sword and shield close. "I yield the ground, but not my steel." Hothrog snorted and looked further down the pass. 3 carts and several men. He bared his tusks at the she-man and spoke in the human language.
You are the painted woman, Pyrrha?
I am. She made a half-smile and cocked an eyebrow at him. The painted woman means something very different in Doria. Hothrog's massive shrug was eloquent in its indifference.
You guard the wealth that walks on wheels. What is it?
He waved his horn-tipped fingers at the carts.
Why come to Fraka?
A gift, said Pyrrha. Hothrog snarled.
All man gifts have a price. Let us see.
The witch warrior beckoned the carts forward. Pyrrha stepped back to allow a man to address Hothrog. He was puny and pretended calm while sweating under the gaze of the warlord. Greetings, high-exalted Hothrog, supreme warlord of the Fraka and its tributes. The flowery human words that Durians used were uncommon and tangled the human speech, making Hothrog frown. Gorstak leaned close.
That's a compliment,
she explained in Orcish.
I know!
Hothrog snapped at the smirking she-orc. The man paused, obviously thrown by their exchange.
Go on,
grinned Gorstak, showing all her teeth. I am Tolito of House Kalenus. My master Motorius has been asked to act as an intermediary on behalf of... The words started to mash together for Hothrog.
What's in the carts?
He snarled impatiently and waved at his warrior to strip off the coverings. Pyrrha snapped out an order for the cart hands and guards to back off. There was a stir of excitement amongst his warriors. Hothrog pushed past the puny one and crooked a finger at the she-warrior for her to follow. The hall was staggering. Arrows, spears, axes, shields, and even small plates of armor. Hothrog picked up an arrow and inspected it. It was tipped with the fire iron beloved of men, hardened in their great forges to take a lethal edge. He turned to the she-warrior.
Why?
He asked suspiciously. Pyrrha glanced at Toledo.
No,
snapped Hothrog.
I talk to you.
He pointed at Pyrrha.
The one who walks the borders of Shakhtar, Rift Warder.
Toledo backed off hastily. Pyrrha nodded and pointed north. Varrig is coming. The one who pays us has this offer. He will arm the Fraka. He will arm all of those who fight Varrig.
What is his name?
Do you care? Hothrog's mind played the reasoning through. Someone wanted to stop Varrig, or at least slow him. Living close to human lands, he knew this might matter one day.
Yes. Tell me.
Lord Jovianos Stalianos. Hothrog snorted in disdain. He knew that one wanted to be the human high chief. The more orcs killed each other, the more secure his borderlands.
Very well. We take these weapons.
He showed his teeth in a grin full of carnivorous mischief.
And we will share them.
Are you hiding something from me? Elayna asked. Leusios flinched at the accusation. He had visited Elayna as usual and found her in a determined mood. What more can you tell me of the night Kerne died? Elayna asked softly. Was he protecting me?
Mikrigg and his men thought they were protecting you.
He took her hands in his and met her eyes.
It was a tragic misunderstanding, and I will always regret that I arrived too late.
That was true. He could have stopped it all had he arrived sooner. There was no blood on his hands, he had to remind himself.
You were friends. It's only natural.
She jerked her hands from his. Natural? No, it's not. It's like living with a scorching ghost. She stood and gripped one of the wood pillars.
I can leave, he offered.
Elayna's mood had him off balance. The past year she had drifted through life, remote and forlorn. He had no idea whether this change was good or bad. She did not seem to hear him, Instead, she ran her hands along the half-orc's carvings. He stood up.
"Stay."
It was an order. He stopped. She drew in a deep breath and went to her workbench, which was covered with garments Elayna had passed to her for finishing. On top of them was a wreath woven from willow wands and garlanded with early spring flowers. She picked it up.
"Take me to where it happened."
Leusios held her gaze, trying to divine whether there was any accusation or anger to be found there. There was none, just a deep sorrow, like an old wound that wept rather than bled.
"Of course."
The winds had abated, and the clouds were thin enough to let a milky sun shine through. Frequent rains and mountain meltwaters had the Ruthiel churning with silt. Strange how the place looked so different in the spring sun.
"This is it,"
he said. She nodded and waded a few steps out into the river. There she stood, lost in her own thoughts for a while. Leusios wondered what memories she was conjuring from her time with the half-orc, and tried to resist the old jealousy stirring. Finally, she set the wreath upon the water.
"Thank you, Kerne. You gave me hope. Because of you, I survived losing the owl. I survived losing father. I will survive losing you."
They watched the wreath drift out, slowly at first. Leusios felt a creeping guilt as his mind's eye recalled the half-orc's body doing the same, unresisting and accepting. Then the wreath caught the current, just as Kerne had done, and bobbed away through the muddy swirls. Leusios stepped closer to hold her. She did not resist. The tears for her half-orc were flowing freely now. They watched the wreath until it vanished around the curve of the river. Leusios followed Elayna back into her hut.
"Now,"
she declared curtly,
"you need me help."
She stoked the fire and put on a pot of nettle tea. He watched her guardedly, both curious and worried about what would come next.
"I know what you're hiding from me."
He swallowed. His plan, the land, the beans, the magic. What had she worked out?
"You're ruined,"
she stated. Leusios stared at Elayna in shock. She carried on in a matter-of-fact way.
"I had to ask Trubios what a loan was, but I think I understand. All you did in that first year after the Durians arrived, rebuild the mill, the extra grain. You did not have enough money, so Gawain arranged for other people, Durians, to lend it to you. Now they want it back, and because of the problems with the mines, you can't pay."
"Who told you?" he gasped, his dry mouth making him hoarse.
"Don't waste your breath denying it."
Her words were not angry, just tired.
"Whatever we do goes wrong,"
he burst out.
"This year there were even more landslides in the mountains. It must be all the rain we've had. The road's impossible." "I heard all the mine owners had agreed to work together to clear it."
"Yes, and we built a communal toolshed. But that work had barely begun when it burned down, just like last year. Tension is high. The miners drink too much and fights break out all the time. Tools rust quicker than is natural and keep on breaking. Hanley Smith has been overwhelmed with demands for repairs. He took on young Lathan to be his apprentice. But then the same ill fate caught up with him. The shelter for his charcoal stacks collapsed during heavy rain. In his haste to dry the fuel out, Lathan accidentally set light to it." Elayna nodded.
"And the hauntings?"
Leusios put his hand to his forehead to massage his headache.
"Well, the stories are odd," he admitted. "But the men are convinced enough. Some mines they refuse to enter. There's not enough gold to make good the debt."
He trailed off.
"How much?"
Leusios recited the figures as if they were etchings on his tombstone.
"It's impossible."
He looked up at the thatched roof. He was ruined. He just wanted to enjoy a few more months before the inevitable came. Elayna put a firm hand to his chin and drew his face level to hers.
"You're not finished, but you need to get smarter. You're under attack, Leusios Miller. The whole of Blackstone is. Think. There haven't been landslides this bad in all the years I remember. And all those accidents. This isn't normal. This is by design. You need to thwart whoever's doing it so the gold can flow."
He stared at her, feeling a stirring of hope and attraction.
"How?" "You need to do two things. First, they may be a ghost to you now, but whoever's doing this has to be human. They can be tracked and caught. I hate him, but you have to offer me Krieg the captaincy," she admitted through gritted teeth. "Yes, he's a complete shit, but no one else can track and command the militia like he can."
"He's still in exile. You forgive him?" She shook her head.
"No, I don't know if I ever can. But things are desperate. Second, you need 100 orals to cover your payments until the mines produce again. If you stop all your self-pity, I'll give it to you."
"How?"
"Not your business. I'll lend you the money until you get your gold south. Then you pay me back."
It took him a moment to realize that he was gaping at her. "You would do that for me?" Her smile, as warm as the sun, broke through her practical manner.
"Of course,"
her voice softening.
"Because you've already done it for me. But,"
her practical tone returned,
"there are 4 things I ask in return."
"Name them," he said.
"Me father made sure I could read a little and understand written numbers. But I need to be better. Will you teach me?"
"And have the pleasure of her company guaranteed?" He beamed at her. "I would be delighted. It's the least I could do."
"Aye,"
she went on briskly.
"It is the least. So, second, I also want you to be honest with me. Bring me your problems. Do not hide them."
He nodded more warily. "And the third thing?"
"Tell me exactly what happened the night Kerne died, and don't miss a thing."
Leusios nodded with a careful neutrality. In his anger, he had lied to Kerne about who had hit Elayna, but no one would ever know any better. But if that was the third ask, what was the final one? "And fourth?" he prompted tentatively. She fixed him with a resolute gaze.
"I need your help to find the Durian bastard who killed me father."
Leusios had explained to Elayna what Motorius had told him about the 3 types of Durian assassins. It made her next step obvious. She found Vibnia holding a class with a dozen Kiddish children in the little church on the market round. She patiently waited until the priest dismissed them.
"How can I help you?"
Vibnia said as her students streamed out of the church in a gaggle of childish banter. Elayna watched the children thoughtfully, enjoying the momentary distraction before focusing back on the priest.
"I need your help. What do you know about Durian assassins?"
Vibnia raised an eyebrow.
"That was not what I expected you to ask," she admitted. "But now you have. Can I assume this is about your father?"
Elayna nodded.
"Such things are not to be spoken here."
She inclined her head to the wooden circle on the altar.
"Come, have some little tea in my lodgings."
Vibnia's home was attached to the church and was built to a solid Durian design. She brewed the tea and served it in clay beakers before sitting on a simple stool. She leaned back against the timber wall and steepled her fingers and waited for Elayna to speak. Elayna sipped from her own beaker and began.
"I thought the Kerne might have helped me work it out."
She broke off to sip her tea again.
"Then I convinced myself that the assassin might betray themselves somehow."
She shook her head.
"I can't let this lie."
Vibnia nodded slowly.
"We feel his loss keenly."
Elayna nodded and blurted out all she had guessed.
"He has to be a Durian. I would know if he was a Keat. And Durians gain from killing Durantos. Caesonius for secrecy, Talianos for revenge."
Vibnia raised a commanding finger.
"What good will this do you? What end do you seek?"
Elayna blinked.
"I'm a Keat."
Vibnia showed a ghost of a smile and cocked her head.
"Revenge, then. In Duria, we share cautionary tales about revenge. But your bards celebrate it. So who do you seek? The weapon or the wielder?"
Elayna studied the priest. Vibnia was the even hand that guided the spiritual health of the community. She had accepted their Keetish ways and always placated the bards when they passed through, even the fiery Kerithwig. But this conversation was different, she realized. The mild-mannered priest had fought alongside Kerne several times, and Elayna started to wonder if she was glimpsing the side of her that he had seen. In a flash of insight, she answered the priest's question with one of her own. "What is this assassin to you?" Vibnia raised an eyebrow, and her mouth set in a thin line. She nodded as if concluding an internal debate and picked up her tea again. This time she drew a long sip before returning it to its plate. "Two types of assassins concern me." "Not three," Elayna interrupted. If the interruption annoyed Vibnia, she did not show it. She even gave another slight smile. "No, if a mythical Leusios is among us, they would not be our concern. Our target is a professional killer or a cult assassin, and I am left in little doubt. 3 precise strikes on your father, 1 in the lung and 2 in the liver, were intended to incapacitate while causing lingering but certain death." Elayna felt the blood drain from her cheeks. For a moment she was back, holding her father's hand as he faded away. Vibnia leaned forward and touched the back of her hand with her fingertips, her eyes intense. Her aura was both comforting and commanding. "That is the unmistakable cruelty of a cultist. They relish suffering. They are our greatest enemy." Elayna shuddered and wondered why she had never thought to ask the priest before. "How do you know so much?" Vibnia sat back and picked up her beaker. She studied her reflection in the tea for a moment. "I was privileged to study in the citadel of the Proto-Custodius, in the great mother city of Doria herself, second only to Avas in its wealth of knowledge." Elayna was incredulous. "Then why come out here to the edge of nowhere?" Vibnia raised her finger in challenge again. "But this is not nowhere, is it? All that I read told me this is where I had to be. Will you help me find the assassin?" Vibnia took a sip from her tea and nodded. "Yes, and who hired him? In return, please, tell me about your dreams." Leusios was leaving the market round in deep discussion with Vibnia when they were both hailed. "Master Miller, Ophrosykaitas," the voice called out in a rich Drazian accent. They both turned to see Pyrrha, the caravan guard, leading her horse towards them. 3 empty wagons led by Tolito were rumbling through the ford behind her. Leusios smiled at her uncertainly. Most Blackstoners felt intimidated by the muscular witch warrior. "How can we help?" "I am the one helping you," she replied. "Recently, I passed through the plain of the Elder Tombs. One caught my eye, specifically the one you sheltered by, if I remember Jorwin's tale." "What about it?" Leusios asked, taken off guard. "It's been broken into." Vibnia raised an eyebrow. "Fascinating. We should investigate." The priest hired a horse from Ledlos so she and Leusios could ride together. "You could be less obvious," Leusios said, speaking directly into Horth's mind as they cantered across the plateau towards the shadowy plain.
"She's already guessed,"
Horth replied knowingly. Leusios glanced at Vibnia. The priest returned the look with cool neutrality. They reached the tombs while it was still light. The purple lightning flickered within the churning gray canopy above, but the wind was subdued, giving a mood of surly quiescence. Leusios looked around himself nervously, and Saltator gave an agitated snort. Amongst the elder tombs, it was hard to shake off the sense of being watched. They found their tomb and could see the scorch marks and charcoal fragments from the fire they had shared with Kerne and Jorwin. "How long ago now?" Leusios asked thoughtfully. 2 years, said Vibnia as she dismounted. The bard's voice still echoed back to him, telling the tale of the fire and the fall. The double doors that had stood unyielding at their backs were now twisted wrecks, torn asunder by unimaginable force. "The Tombbreaker must have wielded tremendous power," he murmured. They tied their mounts to a pillar. Leusios soothed Saltator by stroking his long nose. The horse shifted from hoof to hoof, being keen to get away from the unsettling nature of the place. Then he knelt to touch a fallen door, feeling a tingle. "There's magic still in the bronze." He ran his hands along the lines of tortured metal. More like a sustained push than an explosion, until they buckled and gave way.
Opening magic, rather than a battle spell? Asked Vidmia.
Leusios shrugged. He suspected the priest knew more about such things. He would share the memory with the Major to find out more later. They looked into the tomb. Vidmia dropped her voice to a whisper in the presence of the ancients.
No one has entered one of these ancient chambers in all the years Blackstone has stood.
Who could have done this? Asked Leusios.
The cloaked rider? Suggested Vidmia. Maybe he was breaching some other tomb that night.
The spirit had been angry that night and targeted him, thought Leusios. Why?
Well, you don't pay its wages, so unlike most of Blackstone, it didn't have to like you.
Shut up, snapped Leusios out loud.
I beg your pardon? Asked Vidmia.
Oh, Leusios blushed. Sorry, just a random thought.
Is that all I am to you?
There was a black flurry, and Horth landed on Saltator's pommel. The horse jumped in surprise and gave the raven a dirty look. Horth ignored it, dexterously shifting to maintain his balance. Vidmia was focused on the gloom within the tomb.
Let's go in.
Leusios nodded and reached out a hand. Lee! They entered the tomb, the sphere of light bobbing ahead of them. The anticlimax was crushing.
It's bare.
The only ornament of any kind was a great urn at the far end of the chamber. Otherwise, the fitted stone was plain.
Durian emperors raised great tombs with many cunning devices to trick robbers,
Vidmia advised. I see no such device. Leusios scowled, and yet he reached his hand out to something only his instinct suspected was there. His hand met resistance, like pushing into a wall of honey.
I think the command you need is Rebel Chang,
Horth interrupted. Have you been looking at my papers again? Leusios accused him silently.
The other birds make such poor conversation. I get bored.
Leusios considered the vial of essence in his inner pocket. He didn't have much because Murgathwin had needed last year's crops for food.
Try touching the source,
coaxed Horth. Very well. Leusios closed his eyes and imagined the source, a dark, swirling mass of energy. He reached out and touched the growling wellspring. The spark was tiny, the trickle agonizingly slow compared to what he had experienced before, but he had done it without aid. He built the power slowly and raised his palms. Concentrating hard, he pushed them into the resisting air. The ancient magic curled around his palms, turning honeyed resistance into thickening clay. He curled his fingers as if grasping two invisible drapes. Rebel Chang! The magic shot down his arms and through his fingers. The arcane veil wrapped around him like invisible silk and then parted. He passed through without taking a single step forward. The tomb walls were instantly lost behind burgeoning forest growth. A sun, unseen above the dense canopy of leaves, filled the mass of foliage with a light so intense that even the abundant vegetation could not block it out. Leusios would have been crowded by branches and leaves had not the original intruder blasted his way in with fire. Scorched and charred branches lay scattered around him, and one tree had been felled by an explosion that had ruptured its trunk. In amidst the devastation lay a shattered statue. It had been an elegant figure bearing a staff. The face was beautiful and alien in form, slender with pointed ears and angled eyes. Now it was a broken torso laying on its back. It had one hand raised to command halt, now pointing ineffectually upwards. Leusios stood perfectly still. Vidmia and Horth were gone. He was alone. He listened intently. There was no wind, not even a sigh to stir the multitude of leaves. Neither were there little creatures to rustle in the undergrowth, nor birds to rattle the branches. And there should be smells, rich forest smells. While apparently full of life, this place felt as dead as the tomb he had just left. Such was the implacable silence that when the noise came, Leusios heard it clearly despite its infinite softness. Sobs, great racking sobs whispered on the line between conscious hearing and imagination. Who's there? He took a faltering step towards it. Violator! The roar burst through the forest, sending the leaves into mad spirals around him. A giant vaporous face twisted with alien rage tore through the vegetation towards him. "Despoiler!" No, I seek knowledge," Leusios cried in desperation, backing away. "The knowledge of Mathdrax and our Lorth a Dragona is not for lesser folk such as you." The wind became a hurricane, tearing through the forest, bending the trees and filling the air with dead leaves. Leusios shrank back, barely able to raise his eyes to the luminous fury. "Do not think me so foolish as to allow another to deceive me!" The last syllable swept him up and expelled him with such force that he flew out of the tomb door and plowed into the sand. He propped himself up, dazed. Shaking his head, he stared back into the tomb. "Leusios!" Vibnia called out in shock. Saltator snorted nervously and looked at him. Horth just cocked his head in curiosity.
"Did you find anything?"
That's the end of Chapter 20, Dealing with Ghosts. Next time, we'll be traveling hundreds of miles away to a dusty battlefield to discover the fate of our favorite half-orc. Thanks so much for listening. If you're enjoying this series, please help us reach more listeners by liking, sharing, and commenting. We'll catch up again in the next chapter.